thank you for coming along. This session is about, I think, one of the central issues at the moment, and it's about looking at the myths put about by many people in power, which are consistently and repeatedly eroding support for those in poverty, those on welfare. And this session, I think it will be easy if this session becomes a kind of a collective rant about our frustration and anger about these things, and there'll be countless examples we can give, and I'm sure some examples will be useful, but it's also supposed to be about thinking about how we can challenge some of these myths and begin to change the nature of reporting and coverage of welfare issues. Can everyone hear me okay at the moment? Great. On the platform this afternoon, I'm very pleased to introduce, firstly on your left, Adrian Sinfield, Professor of Social Policy from the University of Edinburgh, a long-time author on welfare and campaigner as well. And to his right, David Bradwell from the Church of Scotland's Church and Society Committee, recently involved in the report which he's going to talk about, an excellent report on some of the myths and misreporting in welfare issues. So I'll invite each of them to introduce the topic for a few minutes, and then we'll get the discussion going. So Adrian, I think, first.
Thank you, Nick. I hope you can all hear me. As an academic, for many years I've been teaching a course called Social Security. Sadly, successive governments have got rid of social security and now seem to have a good scheme called social insecurity, which is working very well. I used to be able to call my courses From the Poor Laws to Beverage, and I'm now thinking that I should reverse it, and it's now from beverage back to the poor laws, the appalling things that are happening. I don't want to go on about that today. I think there's been a great deal of good discussion in the conference about the appalling things that are happening in terms of so-called welfare reform. I've got a handout here, and there's some more copies up at the registration table if you haven't got one. Simply to save me saying so much, the first page of this is on the Stick Your Labels website, which the Poverty Alliance has set up. What it does is to summarize and to give you the links to a lot of reports that have come out recently, including the one that David will be speaking to in a moment, about myth-busting, the ridiculous stories that come out that we know are untrue but are repeated time and time again. So I've given some examples here. On the second page, this is more a bit but myself. I've become increasingly concerned in the it's now just over 70 years since the Beveridge Report of 1942. Beveridge would be appalled and shocked, not only by what is being proposed, because he worked so far to get away from the poor law, but by the way in which people dependent on benefits are being talked about. It really is a dramatic difference between the way in which Beveridge wrote and talked about people who might have to claim benefits and the way in which the current and recent administrations are talking. And this is why it's so important that we move beyond the myths. So it's absolutely vital that we challenge this. And I hope, although it's a rather big setting here rather than an informal room, we can get some feedback from all sorts of people about what has been effective in terms of challenging the myths. So here's my document. The bit at the end is in fact something which I've been nagging Peter Kelly to reissue. Just before the last Scottish national election, the leaders of the main political parties in Scotland all signed this statement condemning stigmatisation of people in poverty and on benefit and stating what they would do. And I think it really has made a difference. And I think a number of civil servants are aware of the rather different tone in which they're expected to write north of the border and south of the border. And so I think this is a particularly good point that needs to be pushed in front of people. And when you get politicians and others making these stigmatising, demonising statements in Scotland, then please show them this. And the sooner we can get the UK politicians to sign this, the better. But David.
Just really a quick canter through the report that we published at the beginning of March. There's information about it on the screens at the moment. We really trying to identify maybe some of the 6 or so commonest myths that are peddled by media and the politicians, and that are believed by large numbers of the general public. And for us in the church is something that we're finding more and more, is that they're believed by a larger number of churchgoers as well. I won't be going into any real detail on them because I would like to encourage you all to go away and read the report itself. And I think we'll spend more time usefully discussing what we might do together to challenge these attitudes. But just 1 or 2 things to look at. So here we are. Benefit fraud is at historically low levels, 0.9% of payments. And yet, if you believe what some of the politicians and media will say, benefit fraud is the root cause of all of our financial problems. People who are on welfare benefits are on the fiddle. They are scrounging. Well, actually, not compared to those who are avoiding tax. And the little green dot represents the 1.9 billion that's supposedly lost in fraud, whereas the red dot is the 15 times larger 30 billion pounds lost in tax avoidance. So is fraud really just a drop in the ocean? This graph shows the rise in public spending on various aspects of government spending over the past 20 years. Welfare is the blue column on the left, and it's increased about 33% over the last 20 years. But that's smaller than the overall government spending, which is the green bar on the right. And compared to pensions, education, and health, it's actually quite a meager increase. Now, I'm not saying that spending on education, pensions and health is a bad thing, but it's just that we shouldn't really blame the welfare budget and therefore people who depend on the welfare budget for an increase in government spending. One of the common myths is that people who are on benefits are either lazy or have problems with alcohol and drugs. Well, the statistics show that that is also false. People who are full-time employed tend to drink more regularly than people who don't work. It's an easy life on benefits, apparently, according to some in the media and politicians. Well, not really, if you consider that the average healthy life expectancy of a Scottish man is, in the poorest 10%, is in the mid-50s. So it pays to be out of work and have kids and get lots of child support. Well, but it doesn't really, because only 8% of families have more than 3 children. So it's not exactly a lifestyle choice. Disability living allowance is funding a lifestyle for drug addicts and alcoholics, not in truth, actually more people are terminally ill who receive DLA than who have substance abuse problems. The terminally ill is the yellow, tiny little thing, and then the alcohol and drug problem users are the very bottom, the red. Now this is why we were kind of motivated to act, is that attitudes amongst regular churchgoers far being from more generous and caring, is actually a mirror of where the rest of society is heading when it comes to UK poverty. The statistic on the far left is taken from the British Social Attitudes Survey, and the questions, if you can't read them, it's the percentage of people who say that people are in need because, and the green is it's inevitable part of modern life. The blue is unlucky. The orange is laziness or lack of willpower, and the red is because of injustice in our society. The column on the right asks clergy, and this is research that has been undertaken by the Church Urban Fund. So you can see that people in church leadership positions still believe it's a systemic problem of injustice, but actually when you ask regular churchgoers, pretty much mirrors the rest of society, with quite a large chunk believing in laziness, unluck, or it's inevitable. So churchgoers might be happy to give to charity or donate to a food bank, but they have little sympathy for those in need and no understanding that it is unfair systems rather than individual misfortune or bad decisions, which is why people are where they are. So for those of us like myself who work on the border of politics and theology, we're recognizing this is an increasingly serious issue for the church, but one where we hope that education and awareness and discussion and challenging these falsehoods, we can make some progress. That's really all I have to say. I'm just going to have the web link and the Twitter hashtag back up for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to both of our panellists for admirably brief introductions, but setting the scene, I hope, for discussion. So it's really over to you to comment on what you've heard, to add to it. Does the sort of summary that David provided of attitudes reflect your own experiences? Are there things missing there? But also, have you had any success in challenging these images, taking up campaigns or complaints, providing a different point of view for that in the mainstream media? So comments, contributions, please.
Hi, my name's Clementine, and I'm actually, I should probably put this out there, I'm actually doing a PhD involved with the Church of Scotland, doing some research with one of the projects that they run in their priority areas, which are some of the parishes which are in the kind of lower socio-economic groups. And I kind of just wanted to say that I think this is a really great piece of work that you've done. I have read it. But I find with a lot of these things that it's kind of like, and forgive the pun, but it's like preaching to the converted. Everyone in this room probably agrees, has probably come across a lot of these stigmas in various different guises. And I was just kind of wondering what we can do to kind of reach out to those people, you know, the Daily Mail readers, for want of a better term, you know, who are kind of really believing all this. One of the things that I have been doing as part of my work with Church of Scotland is going out to women's guilds, because we're doing a bit of fundraising with them. And I've just kind of gone out and presented the work that I'm doing with the women's groups, and even just kind of sitting people down in a room and just kind of saying, like, this is what's actually happening out there. And I have found that there are a lot of women who've kind of gone, I didn't even know this was happening in Scotland. I didn't even know that this was such a problem. And for me, I feel like that's kind of me doing my tiny little bit that I can. But, you know, as people here today, what can we do to kind of reach out to those people who aren't as, you know, enlightened as the rest of us here?
So straight to the heart of the matter. How do you reach out beyond the usual circle of talking to people who are like-minded? Other contributions at this point?
Yeah, just following on from what Maxine is it? Clementine. What Clementine said there, and what can we do? You know, how can we counter the hysteria for any other paper, but the Mail especially, when it's headlines like scroungers and things like that. I believe it's all it's a common theme through the 2 days of this conference. It's all through education and going into community groups and highlighting cases that are opposite of what the media is portraying as the unemployed, the scroungers, having an easy life, having these big 50-inch plasma TV screens and stuff, and actually educating people to the reality of people on benefit living hand to mouth, you know. So it's really down to us to go into community groups and any groups and educate them towards that. There's no point in, as we've said earlier, as everybody in this hall agrees, it's the people we need to reach out to, you know, that are swallowing these lies. So that's the way I see it, through education.
One thing that I do think is that when we're trying to make the point that we're not scroungers, we do need to actually just be careful that we're not suggesting that we're not scroungers but other people might be. It's just that's not us. And I do think I took part in a Hardest Hit campaign well, to call it a march is a bit of a laugh, but, you know, because we were mainly rolling in our wheelchairs, but in Edinburgh. And one of the things which alarmed me, and I do a lot of work with the MS Society, but we had banners up which said, "I'm not a scrounger, I have MS." And I think that was a really worrying message to give, actually, that, you know, if you didn't have an obvious and diagnosable and very clear, respectable disability, you might be a scrounger. So I think that's just something to bear in mind.
Thanks, Nick. Hi, good afternoon. I'm Charlie Martin from the Roots Out of Prison project. Yet again, what we're seeing constantly is the demonisation of not poverty, but of poor people. And it's an insidious and protracted campaign by the media, and it plays entirely into government hands. It's how we fight that, I suppose, is the question. And I'm always remember Muhammad Ali being interviewed once, and he was asked why he was such a successful boxer, and he said, "Well, I pick fights that I can win." So should we be picking the fights that we can win, and how do we do that? I'm kind of always wary that there's an old adage that you never pick a fight with someone who buys their ink by the barrel. Obviously the press barons. Now, if we take a lead from the next generation, right, the kids that are coming behind us, they don't buy newspapers. They communicate in a totally different way. They don't need to buy ink. So really what we have to be doing now is embracing social media in a much wider capacity to get our messages moving and get people organised. Thanks.
Adrian and David, do you want to make any sort of responses or comments on what you've heard so far?
Oh, it's not new. My first piece of research in the UK on social policy was interviewing people on Tyneside in 1963-64 about being unemployed. And I heard stories then about people who were fiddling the dole. And the people in North Shields told me the people on South Shields were doing all sorts of terrible things. And the people in South Shields told me about the people in North Shields. There always tends to be some of these tensions. What I think has changed really dramatically, and what I feel bad about because I didn't recognize the significance of this, was that the whole quality of this debate shifted during the 1970s and the 1980s, when you had senior politicians now pushing the line. In fact, one politician who edited a book called Down with the Poor, who talked about people on benefit being broiler chickens, became Minister of Social Security under Margaret Thatcher, responsible for benefit levels. Surprise, what did he do? It's slowly picked up so that you have had a succession of government ministers who are doing this. We talk about the media very critically, but journalists have told me that they've heard the same politician give one briefing on a report to CPAG and other groups, and a totally different one to the Express and Mail, which has then appeared in a very stigmatizing way in the newspaper the next day. And I think we need to challenge this much more. So to go back to the very first question, I think there's a lot to be said for challenging those people at the top who are making these statements, because it serves their purpose. We're playing into their hands unless we do. But secondly, I think there's an awful lot that needs to be done in reminding our own friends what the real evidence is, and getting them to challenge. And this, I think, is where we slipped up under Thatcher, that we didn't make the argument for collective solidarity, the importance of a welfare state that looked after everybody. And so we're now having belatedly to challenge the we're all in it together mythology. So one example I would want to give you is one of the items on my list, which is about the cultures of worklessness. You know, some families haven't worked for 3 generations. Ian Duncan Smith gave a speech year before last in which he talked about people, universal credit is for people who've never worked. They've never seen anybody in their family work. They don't know anybody in their community who has worked. And he was quite happy with that statement because he repeated it 2 pages later on in his speech, and I can give you the website reference, it's still there. I wrote and asked him, where? After due course, I got a civil servant reply saying he didn't have anywhere particular in mind, although there was high unemployment in many areas, such as Rochdale. And by community, he meant the sociological concept of circle. Well, it seemed to me community and circle are very different. But the reason I'm giving you this particular example is that the Rowntree Foundation has funded academics in Glasgow and Middlesbrough universities to carry out a piece of research over 8 months, which went to find these families where nobody had worked for 3 generations. And they went into the areas in Middlesbrough and Glasgow which had the highest levels of unemployment and asked. And of course, everybody they spoke to said yes. So they said, who? Oh, my friend told me about it. And went to the friend. Oh, somebody else told me about it. They set off to try and find 3 generations of no working, found absolutely nobody. Absolutely nobody. They tried all. They went into pubs, they tried all sorts of places. They put up adverts, they went on the radio, into local free newspapers. Okay, 2 generations. None. There were people who hadn't worked, and there were some of their children, 20 or 21, just a few years into the labour market, who had never worked, but other children were in jobs. And other members of the same family, brothers and sisters, were in jobs. And eventually they found 2 families where 2 generations had hardly ever worked. The younger generation, 2021, had not worked. And there was one family which had never worked at all and was in such a terrible state the man couldn't even walk anymore because of drugs, drink, and a whole range of other things. But they had set out specifically to find this. So I'd encourage you to go to that website. And when somebody talks to you about it, you say, where? Give me a real example. Because this is where good money has been spent and research time has been spent to try and find the case. And there is absolutely no evidence. But do ministers and others with power and influence stop talking about it? No. So challenge them. So I would want to argue for this double thing. Make sure your friends and others are aware of the issue, but also when you hear it being said, stand up and challenge people on this.
I like working for the church for a couple of reasons. One is we're rooted in local communities, and if you imagine a typical church congregation of maybe 100 or 150 people who turn up on a Sunday morning, you know, they run the toddlers group or the cafe or whatever together. It brings together people from different backgrounds. They might live in the same town or the same neighborhood, but people who are older, people who are younger, people who might have moved into the area, people who are richer, people who are poorer. You often find then that the people will be quite understanding about their friend and their colleague and their sisters and brothers that they know, but when they hear about what they read in their paper, the Daily Mail, or what they hear the politicians say, then they believe that about everyone else. And it's that kind of thing about, you know, we might trust our own MP or our own MSP. We know them, we see them in the local paper, you know, but generally politicians we don't trust. And it's that thing about knowledge and familiarity can often break down a lot of these misconceptions, these myths. And so what Clementine was saying about actually talking to people, it's something that we can do quite a lot in the church organisation because we're big and we're well structured and we have people who are committed to kind of sharing this kind of message. The other thing about working for a church, particularly one that's got as big as the Church of Scotland, is that it does open doors to politicians and you know, very senior people. We can say that, well, because we represent 500,000 people, you know, you should listen to what we have to say because it's an important way that you'll get re-elected. So that's something else that we might take on board, is how do we do our lobbying or influencing or engaging with decision makers. And then I mean, that's something that we can all do as citizens. We can all kind of ask to meet our MSP or MP at surgeries and things, writing to the papers. And I know it's kind of, as I say, preaching to the choir, and everyone here's kind of committed to the agenda, but it's these little things that I think, if it's about changing attitudes, if it's a letter in the paper that is read by 100 people or 1,000 people, then that might start the ball rolling in terms of changing attitudes. There was a comment from, I think, down here about not trying to say we're better deserving, or we are. There are still people out there who don't. We've been quite pleased with some of the feedback we've got about our report, but we've had some negative comments from some of the one pensioners support group, basically saying we don't talk about pensions and old age poverty very much in the report, and there wasn't an oversight on our part, and neither do we think that pensioners are somehow need to be neglected. It's just that we wanted to focus on the 6 most common myths that we had. But it's this kind of sense of, are we putting child poverty as more important than fuel poverty? Or are we putting pensioner poverty more important than people who have disability problems? And it's this kind of divide and rule, which is something that, again, we would try and always argue against and try and say, no, it's about a fairer and more generous way of doing things. And it's come back to then, Charlie, your point about demonisation of poverty, and it's all of people in poverty rather than poverty as a concept. And trying to teach the church to do social media is, again, quite difficult because we're quite old and we're quite set in our ways, but we also have kind of, but it's, we do have weekly meetings where tens of thousands of people come to listen to hear about social message, about liberation and justice. So we do the traditional media maybe better than the social modern side, but we'll try that as well.
Okay, thank you very much. A couple of comments just to come in. What's coming across so far is that we have lots of ammunition. We have lots of good analysis of the misrepresentation in David's report, in the research that Adrian was referring to. We've been reminded we already have personal networks and networks through social and religious groups and so on. We haven't necessarily cracked the social media question or the let alone the print media yet, but there's time, so here's hoping. I've got one person down here, one over there, and a lady at the back there. So.
Nell McFadden, Elderly Forum. I also chair the Your Voice Community Care Forum in Inverclyde. And the other elderly forum is one of my other groups. Now, I'm on, you just mentioned it, the young gentleman there has just talked about pensioners' poverty. And this is, I have a bee in my bonnet, as they say, about the way they talk about pensioners, because we get subsidised at Christmas time, we get £200 or £300 at Christmas time, and for the fact that we get this bus pass. I am so sick, tired. I said already, I think, in this conference, they must be fed up listening to me, because we get this free bus pass. I think they're giving us gold, the free bus pass. It doesn't do every pensioner because we can't all use it. I can't use it because I'm physically disabled, and I can't go on public transport, on buses that have high steps. But the other thing is, it's not only pensioners who get it. I've discovered over the years that people with mental health, and I don't grudge anybody else getting it, but I grudge the fact that it's always pointed out that it's a pensioner who's getting it. And I've already said, if you see them talking about the bus pass, you're bound to see a picture of elderly people getting on or off a bus. That's the typical picture that comes out. And they talk about us being scroungers. Old scroungers, old greeting-faced scroungers. I've heard that expression myself. And the thing is, they forget that the elderly people are still making a contribution to this country as grannies and grandpas and baby minders, you name it, we do it, as well as people like myself who are actively campaigning at my age as well. That we're not scroungers, and when the money that they give us at Christmas and New Year is only a sop because they don't give us a decent enough pension. The pension has been altered in the number of years that I've been living. If they'd kept the pension being based on what it was, I would be a better off pensioner today, and I wouldn't need any of their fancy money at Christmas time, it's a worry for pensioners because they can keep coming up to me and saying, are we getting the £250 nail this year? I don't know whether you're getting it till the very last minute, because they can change their mind. They've changed it before. In fact, it was £400 a couple of years ago. It's now £300 for the over 80s, and it's £250, I think, for the rest. But that's not scrounging. We need that money because they will not give us an adequate pension. When I was younger, I was advised, when I got a job in the civil service, I was told, that'll be great, Nell. That'll help you to live when your pension comes in. But it doesn't. It's all added in. We're all means tested, as you know. And at the end of the day, I lost out because I had to pay tax. I don't pay tax now because I haven't got enough. But I paid tax for years. So most older people, I'm not saying they've all worked all the days. They haven't. But most of us have. And we have a valid contribution to make to society. As I said, we're not all just sitting about doing nothing and taking money for nothing. If the government would give us a fair and adequate pension, as we were promised, they went back on their word and give us a fair and adequate pension. It's not only for us today, but as they say in the pensioners movement, us today and you tomorrow. At the end of the day, if you don't get it right for pensioners now, you're never going to get it right for anybody. Thank you.
Hi, Archie Dempster, Greenock. I went into a pub a couple of weeks ago. I know this sounds like the start of a joke, but it's not. Trust me. And there was a friend of mine in the pub just back from his holidays, and I said, Derek, how was your holiday? And he said, I had a great holiday. And obviously the next question is, how much was the drink? And I said, how much was the drink? And he said, that's about €3. He said, but I'll tell you, I was in this Irish bar in Mallorca, and wait till I tell you this story. He said, do you know when that ash cloud was there a couple of years ago? 12,000 Poles missed signing on in Dublin. You know? And you think, 12,000 Poles missed signing on in Dublin, really? And you only have to work out for a couple of months. I went to the other end of the bar and I thought, even at 3 flights a day from Ryanair, 200 folk in a flight, 3 flights, maybe over 3 days, that's still only maximum, 1,800 people? If everybody on every flight was signing on, you know? So, I mean, that myth was pervaded. And at the same time as that, I was reading a book about the Irish banking crisis. And when the Irish banks were really just about to collapse, the guy from a bank, the Allied Irish Bank called Sean Fitzpatrick, went into the Chancellor's Attorney's office and said, I need 4 billion. And the Chancellor in Ireland said, no, you need 6 billion because we've worked out your liabilities. So they got the 6 billion on the Monday morning so the Irish banks could open. But on the Friday night, Mr Fitzpatrick was talking at his golf club in Greystokes in the wealthy suburb of Dublin, and he said, we need to cut back on the pensioners' benefits and we need to cut back on supplementary benefits and income support in Ireland because people are not going to work. And I think those two things are two sides of the same coin, because you need to say, in whose interest is that first story put around that 12,000 Poles missed their signing on at a time when the banks are literally plundering the public purse? And I don't believe any longer it's just somebody in a corner that makes these stories up. I believe these are actually manufactured by PR agencies for the banks. And I don't say that with any conspiracy theory, because that story then goes round everybody. You know, and I say, unfortunately, my friend hadn't chosen to challenge that and pervade it to me as a matter of absolute truth that 12,000 Poles had missed their signing on. But that surely divides the folk in Ireland who say immigrants are stealing our benefits from the people who say, well, wait a minute, why are our benefits being cut? Because the banks have walked away with billions, literally billions. And eventually, I think in the next couple of weeks, Sean Fitzpatrick in Dublin is going to go on trial. And at least somebody in Ireland is going to go on trial. But that myth will be still going round the pubs and clubs of Benidorm or Dublin or Glasgow or wherever. And I think, going back to what Professor Sinfield said, you need to challenge those myths at the time. And most of those myths you can challenge with information that you have, or simply just refuting them to say, that is just completely wrong. What evidence do you have for saying that? My friend had no evidence other than this anecdote, but those I think are symptomatic of the myths. But you need to say, in whose interest are those myths being pervaded? They're being pervaded to take the attention of who really is scamming you.
Hi, Maura Hutchison from Dundee. As regarding the Joseph Rowntree thing, and I know you were meaning families that never ever worked, but if they just stop at Glasgow and no go right through Scotland and go through Fife, where there's villages with 3-4 generations sitting on a doorstep, no chance of working because they were minors. If they just went a few miles up the road, they would have got a lot of who they were looking for.
Michelle Campbell from Fife Gingerbread. We are here with the lone parents for Fife, and they are stigmatised on a daily basis of being benefit scroungers, living off of benefits, their tax credits, housing benefit. But one of the issues that I would like to raise today is the absent parent that chooses not to pay maintenance to their children, that leads the children into poverty. And I would hope the government addresses this. They're closing the CSA next year and they're asking them to go through the child maintenance options. That's an optional process for both parents that can work together. But when there is parents that can't work together because of domestic abuse, or there's any other issues that just prevent two parents from coming together, or a parent that just chooses, I'm not paying it, that would reduce child poverty.
Thank you. So, well, being reminded, more examples about particular groups who get stigmatised, the elderly, lone parents and others. And we're hearing about why, whose interest that may serve. We're still trying to dig our way forward in terms of what we can do about it. So I'm going to throw it back to the panel and look for responses to the particular points that are made, but also comments about how we begin to challenge those myths as they come out. What are the effective ways of doing that, or other contributions?
I think, our report mostly focuses on public attitudes rather than making any policy recommendations. So whilst we might be very sympathetic to more funding for groups or issues that are particular in need, it's not something that our report really talks about. It's more about trying to unpick the truth behind some of the stories that the politicians and the media have used. But I think it's all part, it's not right to kind of separate it from all of the work that we do. So whether it's supporting single parents or people who are pensioners, it's not one or the other. We're big enough, and our movement is large enough to encompass all of these things. So it's about policy change as well as attitudinal change. And then just to really as a comment on what Archie was saying over there, who I think is now left, about the cause of the financial crisis was about banks and failure of the financial system. And yet here we are 4 or 5 years down the line and the banks are still doing pretty well. And in fact, the richest 1% and 10% of society is increasing its wealth. And yet it seems to be everyone else, and particularly in this country, the people at the bottom who are suffering the most. So that's a much bigger kind of question about what is the whole point of society and our economy. And again, we will each come to that kind of conversation with our own ideas and our own thoughts and arguments and opinions. And it's through debate and challenge and engaging with one another about what these things are that we can start, I think, to change these attitudes. That's really all I have to say for this time.
There's absolutely no doubt that many of the depressed areas were massively hit by the changes that occurred, and a lot of people suffered greatly. A lot of people didn't work for a very long time, and some people never worked again. But if you take the Fife example, if you can give some examples, then do pass it on to somebody who they can investigate it, because time and time again, when an example is found like that, it's perfectly true, but it turns out the person worked until they were 33. Then they never worked again because they were decided, employers said they were too old at 40. And I've interviewed employers who said, on Tyneside, anybody over 40 is too old for me. Mind you, they'd be delighted to get them down in London. And so on. But if you actually go to a particular household and start putting them together, They weren't able to find those examples. But can I just take this topic of this session, beyond the myth, challenging attitudes to poverty? I think there's a real danger that we get ourselves caught, as we were during the 80s, in saying, no, this isn't true. The welfare state's okay. It's not all been going on them, the benefit scroungers. My first priority is not helping people in poverty. I do not believe that helping people in poverty is the sort of thing we should be giving our highest priority. It is preventing poverty in the first place. And yet, preventing poverty has gone right off the political and policy-making agenda. You will never get rid of poverty just by lifting people out, because people will be falling in the whole time. And one needs to recognize how important it is to have much higher levels of full employment. During the 1980s, sadly, unemployment was much higher than it is now. People were saying to me, you should stop talking about full employment. You should be, as an academic, responsibly trying to work out how we can continue to live with 10% unemployment forever. And these were other academics saying it to me. We'd given up. And so I think we don't want to do the same thing in relation to poverty. The first thing a civilized society, a democratic society should aim to do is to prevent poverty. Now, there is some poverty, child poverty in Denmark, about 4 or 5%, about a quarter of our rates. I went over there and I spent 5 weeks trying to find out why they had so much less poverty. And nobody was interested in talking to me. There wasn't good statistical information on child poverty in Denmark, except work that had been collected through the European Union. They said, we're not interested in poor children, we're interested in children. We're concerned that every child should have a decent living. We're not just concentrating our programs on poor children. And I really think there was an awful lot of strength behind that. And this is when people talk about the Scandinavian, the Nordic difference. It is the fact that they were talking about everybody being in it together in that sense, so that, every child should have a decent opportunity, not we should improve things for poor children. And somehow or other, how do we get into that sort of debate? And that's another view of going beyond the myth. And so getting trapped into it's not true. So we have to do two bits of it. It's not true. But also we need to be thinking much more about how do we prevent poverty in the first place.
My name is Annette Hastings. I work at Glasgow University, and I just wanted to tell you just a couple of things about some research I did a wee while ago, where we looked at very disadvantaged housing estates which were stigmatised in sort of the public imagination, places with very negative reputations, and we looked at what community groups and regeneration projects were doing to try and challenge those negative images. And this sort of speaks to a couple of points that David's made. One of the things that we did in the research was we had focus groups with people who didn't live on the estates, and we tried to understand, their understandings of what these places were like. And we found that the people in our focus groups who had spent time on the estate, who visited it, who went swimming there or had an allotment there, were much more positive about those places than people who had never been there and who just had their ideas about the place from the papers or what their neighbours or friends told us, told them about it as well. So this issue about knowledge and familiarity being quite an important thing about setting the agenda for how people thought about places. And we also found that the people in these focus groups were more willing to listen to ideas about these places which went against their perceptions of the place if those views were put forward by people who lived on the estates. They felt that the regeneration officials, they were less authentic in terms of what they were saying, the messages they were putting forward to try and challenge images. But when the ordinary people who lived on the estates, when they had an opportunity to use their voices, they were tend to be listened to much more by the people who didn't live there. And so I guess that suggests that one of the ways in which myth busting, needs to come about is around giving much more of a profile for people who are experiencing poverty. And I imagine the EPIC project contributes to that with policymakers, but has got a much bigger challenge and task with engaging with the wider public in terms of changing people's attitudes. So I just thought I would share sort of the findings from sort of what I think is a very parallel and equally difficult issue, and suggest that it is about profile of people experiencing poverty in the public imagination that might begin to make some kinds of differences.
My name's Wesley Gray and I'm from Common Knowledge UK Glasgow. I'd just like to say that being here at the conference over the last couple of days has made me realise that it's not just people like myself with a learning difficulty who have been affected by poverty, but there's also been a lot of parents, like for instance Lana and Nicola from Fife Gingerbread, who have been affected by poverty. And I've been taken in by Lana and Nicola's story, especially in this morning's debate. And again, it just made me realise, that they're struggling as well with, their kids and stuff. And that's what's made me realise that it's not just me that it's affected by poverty. I've been perceived quite a lot by job centre workers in the past as being able to work because of my disability, and that's been a huge problem for me in the past, and that's all I have to say. It's just been great being here over the last 2 days, so thank you.
Another example of how the conversation and discussion of a situation it's part of the education process.
Hi, I'm Carrie Stewart from Dundee. Just going back to what you were speaking about single parents. I myself, when I was younger, was a single parent as well. And when we look at the statistics of the new welfare reform, it's going to cause 50,000 children in Scotland to be living in poverty. And then we look at statistics of 1 in 3 teen mums, children are going to be a teen mum themselves. So that's all going to cause stigma, and stigma therefore there needs to be educated. So how do we go about educating parents with the issues of poverty and making them aware that if you're a teen mum, I'm not saying there's anything against teen mums, I was a young teen mum myself, but I'm just saying how do we educate to get away from the stigma and the labelling of the teen mums that therefore their children are then going to be living in poverty if the statistics are as high as 50,000.
Do you want to respond to any of these last points? We're running short of time. I think.
Do you want to take a couple more points?
A couple more points if you like first. Okay, but we'll pick it up for now. It's your last chance.
Thanks. It's Ross Gilligan from Children in Scotland. The social attitude survey, it's quite depressing reading, and despite what we heard this morning, and sadly the attitudes aren't particularly different north of the border as they are south of the border. They say that the only popular tax is one that someone else pays, but it's almost the opposite way around when it comes to welfare and social services. There seems to be a bit of an element, dare I say it, an element of hypocrisy amongst the general public where, they like welfare or social security or public services if they themselves will benefit from it. But if it's something which they think they will never benefit from, then, they're not nearly as supportive of it. I know we've talked about, this idea of intergenerational nature of poverty, but it's also true that we're all vulnerable to poverty. I remember reading a report, I think it was entitled, One Pay Packet Away from Poverty. I've got a drinking buddy that I go to the pub with, and we both consider ourselves to be living quite comfortably, but just before Christmas he was struck down with mouth cancer. He's off his work now. Luckily for him, he has quite a generous sick pay arrangement in place, but for other people that's not the case, and yet he could be defaulting on his mortgage. All of a sudden it's a different ball game. I know it sounds a bit alarmist, but in some ways, in terms of getting more public support and getting people to make the connection, do we need to make the point that we're all vulnerable to poverty, that something could happen to us and we could all be in that category at some point?
Anyone else at this point? I was looking at some of the Scottish Social Attitudes Survey statistics recently as well. I think, kind of echoing the point you made, they show actually an interesting divergence in trends. On the one hand, there is growing hostility to people in receipt of welfare benefits, and you can see this long-term downward trend in support for welfare payments. And at the same time, you can see this kind of doublethink going on. You can see the line of support for redistribution in general, the proportion of people who believe that inequality is too great in this country and support greater redistribution by government, it holds up pretty well constant. So it's almost like in challenging myths about welfare claimants, we're working with the tide, I think. People have not become more hostile to or less sympathetic towards a more equal society. It's just that we've allowed very powerful voices to demonize a particular group of people and use that as a way of undermining or making legitimate cuts in welfare expenditure. And then also I was struck, I'm abusing my position as a facilitator here, but I've also been struck by one of the things that Adrian said earlier on, that civil servants north of the border feel they have to write in a different style, that a different set of, different way of talking about poverty and a different political discourse happens here, even though there is no difference in social attitudes between Scotland and the rest of the UK. So the problem, in a sense, isn't just about social attitudes, it's about how we maintain in Scotland that more progressive way of talking about poverty, a different tone to politics, or spread that to the rest of the UK perhaps as well. So I think we need to move towards an end. I'm going to ask our two panellists if there's anything they would reflect on across the discussion that we can use going forward, or anything any change they would like to see in terms of our campaigning and activities going forward, that might make a difference in the next year, hopefully before the next Assembly.
I think the most crucial thing is to avoid the divide and rule tactic, and to keep in mind, and that's why I put it on the back of my note, some of the reasons that serve the powerful and well-off to keep benefits low. If you demonize people, the last thing you're going to do is help them. And so, keeping up the hostility is a good way of taking off arguments for improving benefits, extending benefits, improving take-up, doing more publicity to ensure people get all the benefits they're entitled to. And so it's really very cost-effective for those people in power who don't want to share the power and the resources. And I think I want to come back to a point that Nell made, she's gone now, but about older people and benefits. Really, that is being caught, I think, in some of the divide and rule. Because if you actually look at how people live, we live in terms of our families and our contacts. And so when I was interviewing families where the main breadwinner was out of work, very often the grandparents were paying the pocket money. And then when he got back into work, things happened the other way. And so there was a constant shift between the family. And so when you look at it, by and large, poverty hits across generations. And so the more you can do to support all the generations. I mean, there's some quite dramatic work from South Africa where they've started introducing pensions for elderly people, that their granddaughters have been the main beneficiaries because they've helped them stay in school longer. So, the resources do go across the society, and I think the more we can maintain these bonds, and also in terms of the specific question about, what do single parents do, realize that you're not alone. One of the small things you could do is to use the stick your labels website and go and look at all the examples of abuse that are being put up there. But also, if you've got good examples of good newspaper articles or speeches about problems of poverty, preventing it as well as helping the people in poverty, try and put it up on that, so that the more people can keep together and share this, I think is a really very good thing, so that we don't want them, the poor, and we, the people, we, the taxpayer, we, the hard-working taxpayer. We must smash that particular myth, because it really works against doing everything that we all stand for.
We talk a lot about welfare dependency, as if that's somehow a bad thing. Being dependent on somebody else is something that we should be ashamed of or try and avoid at all costs. But I think, if anything, our experience teaches us that actually to depend on one another is what makes a society a community, and to depend on one another, whether that's family or friends, or to provide that safety net that Ross was talking about, to make sure that no matter what our circumstances or whatever misfortune may befall us, there's always going to be something there that's going to make sure that we are looked after. But there's also more than that. It's about not just being the very minimum to eke out a survival, but something that can help all life to flourish. There was a comment about how do we get away from stigma. Jesus said that the poor will always be with you, but he didn't then add, so that's all right then. He said that as a way to challenge, to say that this is going to be a problem for which all people everywhere are going to have to wrestle with and never forget about. So there have been some of the comments today which, in my campaigning and our campaigning, we will certainly take away. I think the comment from down here about making sure that the authentic voice is always heard is crucial. And I'm thinking at the moment about another campaign that we're involved with, which is around international development and global hunger. And if you think, we just had Comic Relief a couple of weeks ago, and it raised lots of money, which is great. But it doesn't change the system which traps people in developing countries into absolute poverty, and neither would just putting a sticking plaster on some of the social problems that we're facing today in Scotland. So it's how do we address the systemic problems, which I guess, and it's by hearing the authentic voice of people in need, and it's events like this that these ideas can be shared and taken on board. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much. I'm going to really abuse my position now and close with an advert. Tomorrow night, Thursday night, 7:30 on ITV, the documentary called Breadline Britain, which is putting out the first set of results from a major survey that's been conducted into deprivation and hardship in this country. It looks back over the last 30 years of change, and it shows us how far we've gone backwards in terms of living standards. So I hope that's an example of a programme which can put out real stories backed up by hard statistics that challenge, at least contribute to challenging some of the myths, and do it in a very public, high-profile manner. So 7:30 Thursday, set your TVs for ITV. Ryan's just thank our two panellists, and thank you to all of you for your contributions. So.